As they or their GitHub co-pilots help them write code, our job is to take off the painful work of security for them. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Mithun. I'm a product manager at DevRev. So Dev as in developer, Rev as in revenue. What we're building is one CRM, which sort of combines customer support, product management, and software development all in a single AI native platform. So yeah, excited to talk about developer productivity. Really interesting topic. Yeah. So when we sort of talk about developer productivity, I suppose what we expect out of developers versus what developers actually think that they like to do or that they want to do is probably quite different. So one of these surveys indicate these sort of different numbers and the kind of activities that people want to do or people are expected to do. Surag, you want to talk more about it?
Yeah, this I know a lot of this data is coming from a recent GitHub research study, but I found a lot of very interesting insights in this piece in the context of developer productivity, and not just developer productivity, but what developers want to do, what they do end up spending their time on. And it's kind of a fun way for us to think about not just developers, but all of our kind of daily lives and where we spend our time. And so looking at this slide, there's a few different dimensions of what's here. On the leftmost side is kind of what managers, development team managers say their teams spend the most time on. So from a leadership perspective, from a manager perspective, what are developers spending their time on? Which is obviously very impactful for any organization, right? What in many companies, especially those where software is a core part of their business, what their developers spend time on is probably one of the most impactful things to their top line of revenue. The middle is what developers themselves say they spend the most time on, which is interesting because it won't exactly align with what the managers think. And then finally on the right is what developers want to spend their time on. And again, this is all survey driven data, but really helpful. And so I think I have so many takeaways, and I know we'll talk about them in some detail going on, but I think for me, the couple things that were pretty interesting here were, when you look at what managers say their teams spend their time on, the first one in there at the top is writing code. Okay, I guess that's great. That's what likely most of us who manage development teams would like our teams to spend their time on. And then you see things like that are adjacent to writing code and building software. Finding and fixing security, ironically, is just number 2 on that list, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But then getting feedback from users, which is driving their roadmap, professional development and kind of expanding their skill set. And then a lot of the things that enable them to actually do the work of writing code and building features, right? Communication with their team, team meetings, coming up with ideas and brainstorming is kind of all the things that they spend their time on. When you ask developers what they spend most of their time on, there's a lot of tactical things there around feedback, right? In the middle column, they spend a lot of time waiting on builds and tests from other teams. Like there's a lot of kind of idle time where they're during the coding process and the build times and the test cycles and all that good stuff. Code reviews, which is like basically feedback from their peers. That is a very time-consuming process, both them providing feedback, but also reviewing or receiving feedback on different pieces, and then all the process of like managing their work there in the middle as well. And then on the right, if we ask developers, or when GitHub asks developers what they want to spend time on, you see things like professional development at the top, which is great, getting feedback from users, which is amazing and driving the roadmap, and then getting automated feedback from validation tooling. I think that's kind of an interesting one, probably a 2023 and 2024 phenomenon, but is interesting nonetheless.
Yeah. So just to sort of, extending this idea of surveys and why surveys are even important from a developer standpoint and how developer productivity is measured, I think there's a huge sort of evolution. There's a radical shift in how productivity has been thought of and has been measured over time. I think back in the 70s, the idea was to measure lines of code, and people didn't sort of, imagine anything beyond lines of code. But what is surprising is that most organizations, even to this day, just look at lines of code and nothing beyond. But it's probably not just limited to lines of code. I mean, any developer that you talk to, they probably hate this notion of lines of code. And the expectation is to have, efficiency as well as effectiveness in what they do. And hence measuring these aspects are a lot more important. One of the frameworks which are sort of very, very famous right now is Space, which addresses this aspect of productivity, which goes beyond just lines of code in terms of effort, and talks about satisfaction, surveys becoming a huge part of it, what we just spoke about. And then, performance, activity, communication, and efficiency. So all of these different factors are so critical to, independently measure and accordingly take action on each of these. Because remember that, each developer is different, each developer is unique. So being able to sort of, individually cater to their needs. It all starts from understanding this through surveys, I suppose. And yeah, what is the AI in all of this? There are so many different things that AI can do in each of these sort of aspects, each of these parameters, to make productivity more measurable, more accessible, and hence more sort of effective in improving productivity as a whole. I mean, Surag, if you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think two main things is, as we think about the then and now in terms of like developer productivity, like the effectiveness becomes, and the efficiency and the dimensions around that have become so paramount, right? Like, lines of code is fantastic and it's trivial and it's easy to measure, but what is the quality of those lines of code? What is the security of those lines of code? What is the value of those lines of codes to the end user, which we're building everything for? And I think this is also one of the very key dimensions on where, AI weaves into a lot of this. Is what AI helps extend really significantly is the ability to get kind of a very vast amount of context in very specific functional areas, right? And so leveraging AI to get context around quality or security or performance or even things like readability or reviews really can help us extend and push on the dimensions of effectiveness and efficiency in so many different dimensions. And I'm just excited. I've already seen amazing outcomes, and I'm excited to see kind of what's next as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, sort of even the idea of, what is subjective, most of these things, when you talk to developers or people in general, a lot of it comes out as subjective, but how do you make it objective? I think that's where AI plays a huge role, right? From sort of sentiment analysis to, going deep and understanding every sort of nuance that there is across each of these aspects, I think becomes extremely critical. And I mean, it's quite exciting where this is all headed. I suppose, in fact, just to sort of double down on the surveys bit, some of the different things that people are talking about, especially when you talk to developers, you know, while the notion probably is that, developers don't really care about customers or don't really care about revenue, it's probably the opposite. Most developers love being given feedback from the end users and direct feedback, unfiltered feedback, which makes it effective for them, which makes the prioritization of work effective. And also, like just getting the idea of what they're building is important or not. I think that's significant, and that plays a huge role in improving the productivity as well. Because if a particular developer knows what is the impact that they're making um, in the lives of their customers, yeah, I don't think there is anything which comes close to that in terms of giving that sort of boost that um, yeah for the developer. Nothing comes close. So
Yep.
yeah, feedback is so critical. Yes, sir.
Totally. Like I think in that same kind of concept, like even if think about ourselves, right? Like I'm often developing and thinking about like what's next, and the single most impactful thing to level up my quality of my work and the urgency of my work and my throughput is knowing that somebody's on the other side waiting for exactly what I'm building, frankly. And I think that in terms of developer productivity and efficiency, of course, but also is really critical in terms of like developer satisfaction, right? Like we often talk about we developers are artisans or are specialists in our craft. And so like what we're building, yes, is software, but we're building for a purpose and for a reason. And so I think this is like so well connected to that same concept.
Yeah, and sort of moving on to the other bit, Surag, you had quite a few thoughts around security vulnerabilities as such, and the number as well of 31%.
Yeah, and this I highlight this because we talked about like how does AI help us extend and accelerate in many ways. And one of the things that was kind of my takeaway from having looked at that some of the survey results was when development manager asked about what their team to work on, the top three things they work on, writing code is at the top of the list. Thankfully, that's in probably so many ways the most important important responsibility. But the second one was development teams finding and fixing security vulnerabilities in the top three, which was only second to writing code. To me, having been in security for quite some time and having kind of also at the same time built and led development teams, I that's discouraging. It's frankly not like, yes, I want everyone to have secure code, of course. That's paramount and important to every citizen across the planet, to keep us all safe. However, development teams having to spend that much time on it is just disappointing, frankly. I think we can automate and help a lot of that. And so, when it comes to like the concepts of AI, yes, AI is going to help developers build and write a lot more software. Okay, that's fantastic. It will help them level up the amount of skills and things that they can do and expand the types of work that they can work on. Fantastic. But I think this is one of those other dimensions where AI and just frankly, kind of modern technology in general can help eliminate some of the work that's very time consuming for developers and arguably in many ways reducing their efficiency, um, while still achieving the needs of this dimension of software, which is security. And so this is one of those areas where I see massive opportunity. I mean, AI, not just AI, but AI and kind of probabilistic approaches and just kind of applied in the right way should help us eliminate things from like finding and fixing security vulnerabilities. But you could fill in that with like quality or accessibility issues, not from the top one, two, or three, and push them farther down the stack into 7, 8, 9, 10, perhaps in terms of amount of time and focus in that area, so that developers have to focus on less things and can really build for users primarily.
Yeah, and what it does is it essentially gives time back to the developers on things that they like doing, on things, I mean, and focus on things that they're most they can where they can add most value. So yeah, so just going, I mean, continuing in that line of thought, yeah, like what else would sort of developers look for? We spoke about feedback earlier, but feedback from validation and from compliance tooling. So yeah, Surag, you made a really interesting point about the fact that this being more relevant in the last few years.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
before we started off Pixee, it was funny. We went and we probably talked to 300 to 400 developers, like hands-on keyboard developers and some other management layers. And one of the things that we were testing for or understanding was what is the comfort level of these developers to use automated tools in their development cycle, right? To do different kinds of things, anywhere from very basic things like formatting and readability to complicated things like helping them understand performance hotspots or security issues or things like that. And the results were a little bit surprising to us, candidly. And this was all, we did this research in early 2022, so before the extra hype around ChatGPT and all the LLMs and AI work. And what our finding was, no, actually, what our belief was, what our hypothesis was going into this research was that junior developers, perhaps developers more recently out of educational programs or newer to software development, would be more likely to accept feedback and want automated feedback from various tooling, because sometimes it's sometimes a very basic information, right, that they can provide. And more senior developers would not want this information as often or as frequently. And as we did our research, the interesting takeaway we had was that there actually wasn't really a difference between comfort levels towards automating or wanting feedback from tooling in their development process from either junior or senior developers. Like actually, our data even showed that the more senior developers had a higher number of tools installed in their IDE, in their pipeline, in their GitHub, and their CI/CD than did maybe the junior developers. And I think the learning that we had was like the seniority of your development and your skill set doesn't actually impact the amount of things that you're worried about that you're an expert on. There's so many things developers worry about, right? They got to write fast. They got to build amazing features. They got to make it really usable. They got to make it high quality. They got to make it cloud native. They got to make it secure. There's like way too many things for them to have to worry about. And this kind of comes back to that notion of in the developer experience community, we talked about cognitive load, right? There's so much load on developers and how the types of things they have to worry about. So this isn't surprising to me. And actually, it was a little bit at the beginning, but has become less and less surprising to me as we think about developers wanting consistent and constant help to have to worry about less things, candidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of double click into feedback, I mean, feedback coming from various sources, sort of assimilating feedback from so many different sources that there are these days is also quite important. And making it extremely simple for them to consume this feedback, number one, and number two, provide insights such that they developers don't have to sort of go to individual sources to get this information.
Right.
Yeah, that plays a huge role as well.
Yeah, and I think to that point, like the other very common thing we heard is, yes, I'm good with the feedback, but give it to me when I want. That was an extremely critical piece of the research that we had was there's certain points in my development cycle or my day or my tooling where I'm doing different, I'm in a different mindset. Don't give me the feedback when it's the wrong time, because then it's very annoying. We talk about in the US, we talk about like kind of backseat drivers. Like, don't give me feedback when I'm not ready for it or I don't expect it. Give it to me at the right time. And I think that's a really, really important concept when it comes to like the research and the user experience and kind of the comfort levels of receiving this support.
Yeah, and what we'll also talk about later on is the idea of not disrupting the flow, which is so critical. So it's a very interesting point that you make of giving feedback at the right time.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the next is in terms of communication. So one of the other things which sort of disrupts the flow, disrupts the sort of the functioning of a developer is communication. I mean, we hear this all the time that as a developer, I'm expected to be in so many different meetings, and I get pinged constantly for help here, look at this particular issue, etc. And it's absolutely impossible to focus on one particular thing and work on that particular task. So the word asynchronous here is extremely important. And providing that ability for developers to pick and choose the information that they need at the right time during the day is so critical. And yeah, I made this point of about giving time back to the developers. This is one way in which you can sort of give time back to the developers. It's essentially optimizing their day, bringing in efficiency in their day. And yeah, communication can be an enabler rather than being a disruptor.
Yeah, and Mithun, I think like an interesting concept here is like how does AI play into this in terms of like providing increasing the amount of communication that can be asynchronous versus synchronous. I see a lot at the strengths of where AI is really beneficial and where we all see these amazing demos and these amazing use cases is it has a really, really, really broad level of context and capabilities kind of right at your fingertips, right? So we could A/B test quicker than we would before. We can search for information faster than we could before. We can have different conceptual concepts from the same source of information really, really fast. And so I think it becomes interesting as I think about, asynchronous communication. A big way of driving asynchronous communication is having the right context at the right time and kind of getting into the depth you need. And I think that's where the AI becomes very interesting, is getting the right information from the right people. There's a lot of stuff playing around, augmenting the communication with the necessary data and information they might need to make it valuable, and even augmenting the creation of the information needed for the asynchronous communication, right? Like I know many of us I use myself, kind of AI note takers in meetings and AI assistants that will help collect a bunch of information and translate text or audio to text. Like all that stuff is really meaningful in terms of extending the amount of asynchronous communication we can have amongst teams, and yet being very effective, right? That's kind of the constant debate on face to face versus asynchronous. Like how effective is that time that we have?
Yeah, and a lot of the time, communications. I mean, the scale of communication itself. There can be so many messages exchanged. There can be so much information exchanged, but the reality is not all of it is important. So this is where summarization kicks in, and I think AI's power to summarize can be leveraged significantly here. And couple that with asynchronous, you're essentially looking at a queue of messages which can be summarized in, let's say, a few lines, and that's all that the developer has to consume at the end of the day. So yeah, this is another way in which sort of it plays into the efficiency of it all.
Yeah, and you see it coming together like in a lot of products and features right now. I think the first things that where applications of AI are being probably, I don't have the exact data, but I would argue is probably pretty evident, is like the most common use cases are these Q&A type use cases, or summarizing data from sets of like knowledge bases, chat bots, things along those lines become very prominent because they can be and be effective at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one can argue that it makes it easier for developers to directly communicate to their customers as well. You made a very interesting point about chatbots. It gives that ability for developers to directly interact with customers as well through these chatbots, because now they don't have a sort of burden of uh, responding immediately, while also gathering all the context that there is about a particular issue or a particular request, and crafting a very insightful and clear message to the customer as well. So there's a lot that can be leveraged with just this idea of AI and asynchronous communication.
Yeah, it's like, if you think about like the dream of, I don't know, an architect on a project, they draw these architectural diagrams, they come up with their plans, and they have detailed documents that explain like what is the vision, what is the proof of concept, what does it look like, how have they tested it, and then if that all gets easily trained into as a knowledge base for an AI model, you can have, to your point, users asking extremely detailed and complicated questions to an AI, not your architect, and yet get maybe not exactly as good, but pretty close to as good answers from this model without a whole lot of heavy lifting. It would be pretty amazing to kind of enable both our users who feel much more empowered in that way, but also our teams or developers to be able to convey or translate their information from like the work product they're already producing into user facing benefit, right? User output.
Yeah, and in that, in fact, the idea of deflection plays such a
Right.
huge role, because if the standard Q&A is essentially managed by AI, then what it leaves is those few questions which are really insightful, interesting for the developers to step in and actually hear from the customer. That probably even convinces the developer to go talk to the customer a lot more,
Right.
because they're not sort of constantly plagued by these typical Q&A questions. So yeah, so there's so much that comes about just by unlocking this idea of asynchronous communication and AI. Of course. So we talked quite a lot about flow. We talked about feedback loops. We talked about cognitive load. But how does this all play into this idea of developer experience? How do they all come together? What do you think, Suraj?
Yeah, look, if for folks in the audience, if you haven't seen or read this research study and you're passionate about developer experience and productivity and efficiency, I highly encourage you to read about it, like just the concept and the articles and the work. And it's all done by, I mean, there's numerous groups who have said similar things in different ways, but the one I've seen most recently that I've really gravitated towards is this research from ACM, the very prominent organization, about this like topic around DevX and what drives productivity. And the way that they've summarized it, that I think is a really great summary to everything we've talked about today, is like there's three primary dimensions that will drive developer experience, and therefore
Mhm.
developer efficiency and developer output and quality. Is the flow state, which is how much time are developers able to, as we say, as I always used to say when I'm writing code, like are in the zone, right? When are they in their state where they're producing a lot of output, which is a really focused, there's not a lot of distractions, they have a really deep understanding, and now they're just like creating, producing at a highest level of state. Um, the second is feedback loops. When I'm producing, I often need feedback. I need to get review on a security dimension. I have a question about how this other thing works so I can incorporate it into my software. Those feedback loops are really critical. And then finally, the cognitive load, like how many different things do I have to keep in my mind as I'm building, right? If I can ideally keep that as minimal as possible, I can focus better and I can be in the flow state longer. And so that cognitive load is a really critical thing, especially like given the concept we were talking about earlier. There's like there's so many dimensions about what a developer has to think about when it comes to like writing any single line of code. And so if we think about this in the context of AI, how does AI help us in each of these various dimensions? I think the opportunity becomes um, pretty clear, and there's a lot of different ways in which these things come together. So I think if you hit build, I just have a couple things that show up on top of this, or go to the next slide, which says the opportunity on each area. If we start at the top, in the flow state is increased amount of time they spend in the flow state, right? Ideally, a developer's in the flow state the bulk of their time, and the longer they're in the flow state, excuse me, the better for all of us because they're producing a lot more. And so this is where like tools like the amazing kind of GitHub Copilot really are driving. Like this is their end goal. They talk about helping developers write 30, 40, 50% more code, helping them produce a lot more because they can stay in that state, they can be in their IDE, and they can create a bunch of volume of output. The second is like then as they do that, there's always going to be feedback loops. They're necessary, right? You want to make sure they write high quality code. You want to make sure that they get the answers they need. And so here you have various examples, but things like that either reduce the turnaround time or the round trip time on a feedback loop, or even frankly reduce the number of feedback loops that are necessary, right? This is where a lot of automated tooling comes into place. This is where like even for folks like ourselves at Pixee, we focus on reducing these cycles immensely. If I have to go talk to somebody and get feedback on someone and find a security expert who can review my code and give me feedback and run another tool, those things are days. And it's like you work on it for a few hours in the flow state, you have to park it for a day or two and then come back to it. And we all know how that feels, no matter what our day-to-day job is it slows you down big time, the context switching. And so I think that's like the shortening. There's a lot of AI examples there. And then the final one kind of on the bottom right is cognitive load. This is, I think, again, the notion of like, from an AI perspective, how do we reduce the number of things that a developer has to keep in their mind and consider for every single thing they're working on? And so again, the beauty of AI is we can provide these very intelligent support structure, co-pilots, assistants, whatever you want to call them, that will reduce the need for a developer to constantly have to keep that top of mind, right? They can focus on their cognitive load, or at least the bulk of their cognitive capacity, focused on their expertise and their focus in their space. And so I think this is a really, I found this to be a very helpful chart as I think about like what are the areas in which we optimize and improve developer experience and developer efficiency by improving these three dimensions of their daily life.
Yeah, and it brings so much more into the conversation. In fact, if you look at it, feedback loops are probably not entirely orthogonal to the flow state, but it can be beautifully baked into flow, like because developers want to experiment, and the result of those experiments, getting that feedback from those experiments is so critical. So I think the point that you made earlier of giving feedback at the right time becomes so important here. And AI being able to do that, I think goes a long way in making feedback effective while developers are in that flow state, and even to extend that flow state, because as you get feedback, it's essentially giving a lot more for developers to think about, to work on, and it gives that sort of adrenaline as well, which probably extends the flow state significantly. And even on sort of the cognitive load, right? Like cognitive load is probably felt when it's not the different signals, different inputs are not coming in at the right time. So, but if it's all sort of baked in again into the overall flow and how it helps at the right time to come up with the best possible output, yeah, it can be so helpful. So AI plays such a huge role in all of these aspects.
Yeah, I think it's exciting times ahead. When you hear companies like what was it, ServiceNow last quarter saying like, hey, we shipped 30 to 40% more product this quarter by using tools like GitHub Copilot and other things like that. It's amazing, and yet there's a lot of tooling and kind of ancillary support that we need to make sure sustained, right? For producing 30 to 40 or 50% more code, how are we making sure that code is just as good as the first or the code we were putting out before? And so I think there's a lot going on, which is quite exciting right now.
Yeah, and not just in terms of cost, but also in terms of adding value. It can create so much value with effectiveness of code that you talk about, Surag. So there is so much value that can be added, which means you're adding on to the top line as well significantly for a company. So yeah, exciting times.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think we can go on with this conversation forever, but yeah, Ria, I suppose you had quite a few other things in mind as part of the session.
Yeah, I mean, if we have any questions from the audience, this would be a good time to drop your question in the chat or raise a hand. We do have one question, Surag. So you spoke about cognitive load in this slide. Could you tell us a little bit more about which specific areas AI can reduce a developer's workload, and what does this free them up to do?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of examples here, but I think the best ways to think about it, for us, like one cognitive load that I'm personally passionate about, of course, is like security, right? We talked about it before. We want developers to write a lot of code, but we want that code to be high quality. We want it to be usable. We want it to be secure. We want it to be cloud native. Like for mature companies, you want that code to be very maintainable. You also want it to be cost effective, right? Like how you write your code impacts your cloud costs directly, and it can be orders of magnitude difference. And so, I think we're already seeing a lot of that. I think we will continue to see more and more where basically you have AI models or hybrid models at some combination of AI plus specific knowledge that are curated together and delivered to a developer in a way that it allows them to not have to worry about that as much, because they know that they have this tool next to them that will keep them honest. It'll be there when they need them. And so I think that's where we'll see it. And we're going to see it in every dimension. Like, Pixie, we aim to be a security cognitive load reducer, but I would imagine, and we're already seeing some in the same context of like your infrastructure, your costs, your quality issues, your testing. There's a lot of different dimensions. I think we'll see it in probably almost every dimension of cognitive load that a developer might have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Surag. And Mithun, so you spoke to us about how developers can summarize more information and prioritize what's important. Tell us a little bit more about how that helps them serve your end users better, and what was this process like before AI?
Sorry, Ria, I lost the last sort of 10 seconds. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So you spoke to us about how AI can help summarize huge volumes of information and help developers prioritize. Could you tell us more about how that helps developers serve end users better? And in the absence of AI, what would that process typically look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, like I mentioned earlier, there is so much that the developer could be doing. I mean, just to think about the number of issues that a developer would work on, right? Let's say, I mean, just imagine a new feature being built, right? Surag talked about so many different aspects that come that become important in building a functionality. But also in terms of the functionalities which already exist, the number of bugs that come in, the incidents that come in. And, from a customer standpoint, everything is important, everything is critical, everything is immediate. So how do you sort of prioritize the set of work items that a developer has to work on? Yeah, it comes back to, I suppose, the customer. What is the customer voice, right? And if we can find that customer voice and feed it to the developer while they're working on, let's say, in their sprints, for example, yeah, that goes a long way. And they don't really need various other people in the sort of mix to tell them what to prioritize. But yeah, there is enough customer bias, enough customer information, enough customer voice for them to figure out what are the items that they need to work on first. Yeah, all of this can be sort of beautifully packaged, summarized, and even classified and provided to the developer at the right time while they're working. And yeah, and of course, the aspect of giving them the ability to focus, right? So yeah, all of this becomes relevant and important.
Yeah, that was a great point. I think we're at the end of our questions. Any closing statements, Mithun and Surag, before we end our session?
I would just say, like, Rhea and DevRev team, thanks for having me on. I think this is a topic I can talk about forever, and it's, everyone keeps saying, like, we're just at the beginning. There's so many opportunities here, and we're seeing a lot of early days here. And I think one of the biggest things that sticks out to me is, as amazing as AI is and the various opportunities it presents, I think we have to do it with purpose. We have to do it with the end user in mind, and make sure we can retain their trust along the way. Because as cool of demos as we can all make, I think it's even faster to lose that trust. And so I think I really respect the folks who are like thinking about it in detail and kind of working through like what is a way that we apply these and still maintain and sustain and hopefully actually even improve the level of trust of the users of these systems. And so I think that's really critical.
Yeah, and it's such an exciting area, developer experience and developer productivity. There is so much value that can be created in this space that, I mean, it's really exciting. And the value that AI can bring in this space is, very, very significant. And it can all, I mean, a lot of it can be achieved with LLMs, which is amazing with sort of the advent of OpenAI. A lot of the things that are happening in the last year and a half, I suppose, we wouldn't even have dreamt of this kind of a change and what we can achieve and the kind of problems that we can solve in this space, which is enabled by these LLMs right now. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mithun and Surag. This was a really interesting discussion. I think we should have a lot more of these. And thank you to everybody who joined in. We'd love to get your feedback from the session.
Thank you all.
Thank you.